Hello and welcome to the spiritguides.co.uk network radio. You're listening to Mark Chatterton. I'm one of the regular contributors to the Spirit Guides website, and tonight I'm going to be interviewing Ian Lawton. Ian is a person who's done a lot of research about the past life regression, reincarnation and stuff like that, and he's written several books all about the soul. His most well-known book is called The Book of the Soul, and just recently, this year, he's brought out a new book called The Future of the Soul, which looks at things like 2012, the shift in consciousness, and what's going to happen in the future. So, without further ado, we'll get on with the interview. Okay, the first question, Ian, is you previously had a career in IT and accountancy, so what made you turn your back on the 9-to-5 and become a writer in the first place?
My heart is the best concise answer to that question. I just had a very strong feeling that I'd had enough of being in the commercial world, and that I needed to get out of it. There were various catalysts and things that helped me with that. One was a young lady that I met around that time, and various other things. But it just felt very strongly that I needed to make a big change, and I didn't know really what I was going to do, other than vaguely try and start doing a bit of research into alternative things and mysteries and that sort of stuff. But it all developed from there, really. So,
had you had any sort of spiritual interest before that time that sort of led you to this point?
No, I hadn't, and in fact, when I started, I wasn't really I think I had some interest in spiritual things, but it wasn't my primary interest at that point. It was much more in those early days. I was interested in ancient history and sort of the Atlantis myths, and I remember the very first thing I ever did any research on was crop circles, actually. So I was into all of that alternative stuff, really, and that's what I started off with. And then the spirituality and the focus on the spirituality came quite a good few years later, really.
Okay, so you wrote your first book, Giza, the Truth, which is based on the Egyptian pyramids, I understand.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What made you choose that as a subject for your book?
Again, this was really all. I mean, I didn't really understand that at the time, but this was just me being led by a series of synchronicities or whatever, because I had approached a magazine which was called Quest for Knowledge, and which was all about alternative stuff, and they said they were looking for an editor, and so I thought, well, I've never been an editor of a magazine in my life, and I know very little about all this alternative stuff, so I must be the ideal chap for the job. So I actually had the gall to phone them up and ask them if they would consider me for the position, and they said they just appointed somebody actually at that point, but they said, why don't you give him a call, because he'll probably need some help. And that chap's name was Chris Ogilvie Herald, and Chris and I got to know each other. I submitted an article about crop circles to him because he said, yeah, we could do with one on that. It was actually 12,000 words long, and he said, there's no way I can publish it. And I said, why not? So he said, well, I'd need about 3 of the editions of the magazine, and with your article only in them, for me to be actually able to fit all this in, because I had no idea at all what I was doing or how long articles should be or anything. So, but anyway, I think he must, and I don't think that article ever got published, but he could tell that I could write and research. So it was his idea to write the book about the pyramids in Egypt, and he knew an agent, but he didn't feel he could write it, and so he phoned me and said, would I write the book with him? So I said yes, because it seemed a good way to get into the market, as it were, and it was a hot topic at the time, so it went from there, really.
I understand it sold over 20,000 copies.
It did very well, yeah.
So that's not bad for a first book, really.
It wasn't bad at all. Although for anybody who's listening who doesn't understand how the publishing industry works, that doesn't mean you actually make any money out of
it. Did you get any reaction at all from the sort of more traditional academics at all?
Not especially. Actually, the biggest reaction we got was from the alternative people who were interested in Egypt, because what ended up happening is that I knew very little about Egypt and about the pyramids, and the book was called Giza the Truth, so it concentrated on the 3 big pyramids at Giza. But I knew very little about all of this, and so I was starting it from scratch. And I'd read all the books by people like Hancock and Baval and all that lot, and was very impressed by them. I thought they made a lot of sense. But what I found when I started really doing the research properly was that an awful lot of those arguments put forward by the people in the alternative scene actually didn't stack up very well at all when you really went to town on them and did your research properly. So we ended up with a book that, certainly in terms of the theory side of things, fell down very heavily on the side of the orthodox scholars about most of the different things to do with the pyramids in Egypt. It was a bit of a landmark book, really, in as much as it was trying to make the argument that, there is no peer review in the alternative community, but I just felt, you've got to tell it how you see it, and sometimes you've got to stand up and say that some of this stuff that's being written by alternative supposed scholars, even though it might appear very academic and properly footnoted and referenced and everything else, actually doesn't really stand up at all. They're just as guilty of being selective as they accuse the Orthodox community of being. So it was quite a breakthrough book from that point of view, because I don't really think there had been that many books like that had come out by people who were completely independent and didn't have any axe to grind, but actually were coming down on the more on the Orthodox side than the alternative side. So I think it made a big contribution in that way.
After that, you did a second book called Genesis Unveiled. Could you tell me a little bit about that book?
Yeah, I mean, this was the book that I always wanted to write at that point. As I say, the pyramids hadn't really held a great fascination for me. It was kind of just a way in. But this was a book that I'd been researching for a few years by that stage. If you like, the Atlantis myths, as people would call them, from all around the world. Looking at the ancient texts and traditions and seeing what they said about this antediluvian race and the origins of man and the creation of man and all of these different sort of texts and traditions. And I had a strong feeling that these things needed to be, that there was an ancient civilization, if you like, that has kind of been lost and forgotten. But I had a strong feeling that the way to interpret the information, what scant information we had about them, was much more from a sort of cultural and a spiritual point of view than it was from any sort of technological point of view or extraterrestrial point of view, shall we say. Because lots and lots of alternative historians, if you like, at that point, and still now, were suggesting that either that, the whole of humanity was created by an extraterrestrial race who came down and genetically modified us and created us and blah, 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 and therefore we're under their control. Well, I looked into that pretty heavily and thoroughly rejected that. And then you also have the people who talk very much about how in Atlantis they had these flying machines and this and that and the other. And, again, I don't think they had any sort of technology in that sense. What I do think this forerunner civilization had was originally a very high level of spirituality that they lost, and they had certain capabilities and gifts from a sort of psycho-spiritual point of view that we are only starting to rediscover again now, I think. And I think they probably did have, maybe were able to use crystal technology and that sort of thing in various ways, but it would have been very much in conjunction with the power of the mind, I think, and therefore, to suggest that they had vehicles and that sort of stuff, I don't think that's the case. And it may even be that I think they would have had permanent settlements, but they may not even have been building in stone. I think they would have been in the temperate areas around the equator. So I just felt there was a slightly different story to be told about these our forerunners, as it were, and that's really what Genesis Unveiled was.
And what was the reaction to that book?
Well, it sold pretty well. It sold up to 10,000 copies, but I didn't, to be honest, get a great deal of reaction from it from anybody, and still haven't. And there are some I'd like to think there are some quite important scholarly ideas in there, particularly in relation to origin myths all around the world. I think I was able to show that they're very, very consistent, and that they really are, if you get underneath the sort of anthropomorphic godlike stuff, they're all talking about this idea of there being a source, a single source that contains the potential for everything, and it bursts forth into creation sporadically to create the whole universe. And this is a very esoteric concept, and it's there in all of the origin myths from around the world, even if it's somewhat veiled in the